Okay. Hello, how is everyone?
Good.
Okay. So we are going to talk about rate structures and negotiation today. This is a class that is most applicable for the account managers, the contracting team, and strategy folks, but it's good for everybody to know. So anyway, just know that. All right. So if you remember, I'm just going to frame this quickly. So if you remember, we're talking about total cost of healthcare. Total cost of care for us, and that broke down into more or less unit cost and utilization, right? And what I'm going to really focus, and when we talk within unit cost, there are a bunch of different ways that we can think about negotiating. One of them, though, is just having really good, tight operations on literally what unit cost we are getting and how do we negotiate that, okay? So that's really what this class is going to be focused on. Yeah, makes sense for everybody? And Nicole, it's fine with the panel?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so now, and so let's see. So at a high level, and this is a class that's going to be a lot of me talking at you because it's just a big download of information. So don't worry about it. But please ask questions in their interim from that. So unit costs it's sort of a weird way that we do it because it's sort of like trying to price every item in a grocery store. So how are you going to price every item in a grocery store, right? There's like literally 10,000 items. It's crazy, you know. And if we're going to go and have to, and for every customer more or less, negotiate a separate price for every single item in the grocery store, it would be freaking nuts. But that's sort of what health insurance companies have to do when they go into a hospital, similar to a customer going to the grocery store, right? So that's a challenge. So there are a bunch of different mechanisms that we use in order to get around that issue, okay? And we're going to go through literally how do we price every item in a grocery store, everything in the healthcare system today. So the first thing is that Medicare publishes the list of the price of what it pays, more or less, to every item in the grocery store. That is not, anyway, they publish because they pay things and more. So, and the biggest component of what they pay is a thing called the CPT code list. That means like for every individual procedure, this is what Medicare will pay for that one procedure if that was all that you did. Okay, so that's cool. Unfortunately, that works really well for physicians who tend to do, okay, I saw this person, I did this thing, I did that thing, I did that thing. It works a little bit less well for hospitals when you're like, well, there's a 6-day inpatient stay. And the way that Medicare pays that is often not to charge you for every little thing that happens, they just charge you for the stay, right? And then there's some other complications of how Medicare exactly pays because they pay this hospital more because it's an academic medical center, but only for certain services, and they pay that hospital more because it's in a low-income community, but again, only for certain services, and you get this very complex set of things, okay? However, at a high level, Medicare is a good base because they have some notion of how they pay people, okay? So we often will quote things in terms of a percentage of what Medicare would pay. And by that we mean, if Medicare would come in and buy a certain set of items in the grocery store, check out, their bill might be $1 million or whatever per 100 people or something like that, you know. Then the question is, should our price be 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million, right? And that would be 100% Medicare, 150% Medicare, 200% Medicare, okay? Pretty basic at this point. So now, the big question though is what basket of groceries are you buying, right? Because if we are vegetarians or whatever, we only shop here, or we don't eat that much, or whatever it is, or you're going to have a different mix of stuff. So you can't exactly say, it's not really fair to just say, let's take exactly what you have to know what groceries you're buying in order to do it, right? So in essence, the way, so at a high level, we will negotiate, to recap, we will negotiate at a very high level, say 150% Medicare, 100% Medicare, 200% Medicare. That's a good sort of back of the enveloping to roughly what we mean in terms of prices. However, underneath, and that's how we begin a negotiation with the hospital system, say, or a provider group or whatever. In aggregate, this is roughly what we're talking about. Underneath that, though, there are two things. There's the price of all the lines of groceries, and then there is how much of each item do you expect to buy. Does that make sense? So detailed price, detailed quantity. Yeah? Makes sense so far? So, now I'll get into what this actually looks like in practice. So I'm going to hit record on my thing. So this is our rate table with Northwell. This shows the price of every line item in the grocery store, okay? And so I want to talk to how we actually go about assigning, like structuring this, and then how we go about evaluating it, okay? So the two high levels is that there's inpatient, and this is just hospitals. There's inpatient, there's outpatient, and then there's physicians. Pretty much that's all there is, okay? And those are the three numbers that we negotiate. And more or less, you can think about them as roughly a third, a third, a third of non-pharmacy medical spend, okay? Now, and they all work a little differently and in different ways. So I'm going to go through each one and describe how they each work, how we think about pricing them, etc. Each one, though, you can quote more or less as a percentage of Medicare. So you could say, okay, aggregate 150% of Medicare, but 200% inpatient, 100% outpatient, and 150 physicians, right? And that's a totally reasonable way to price these things. Yeah? Now, on the inpatient side, inpatient means people staying at the hospital. Simple. Outpatient means people not staying at the hospital. Physicians is non-facility, it's physician stuff. So the essence of the whole inpatient is typically, there's this thing called, and I'll zoom in here, but the base rate, or the inpatient base rate, okay? What that means is, basically it says, listen, the way that Medicare prices these things is to say, I'm just going to agree with give you one number as a base. This hospital gets 15,000, this hospital gets 10,000, this hospital gets 20,000. And then for every sort of what's called a diagnosis-related group, or a DRG, each thing gets a weight. So something really severe like a bypass surgery might get a very high weight, and something less severe like an appendectomy might get something lower, and whatever. And so those numbers go from like a fraction of one up to multiples of one, okay? And so then I can pretty easily price every inpatient stay that way. So I have this base rate, let's call it $15,000, and then if somebody needs an appendectomy, I take the appendectomy number, multiply it by the 15,000, that's the cost of the appendectomy. If I take the bypass surgery, that's that, I multiply that, boom, I get a bigger number. Yeah? Make sense? And that's basically how inpatient care prices. So a lot of times, people will quote for inpatient care, what is this base rate, or also called the DRG base rate, yeah? Also called the MSDRG, or Medicare Services DRG, Diagnosis-Related Group Base Rate. So anyway, this notion of the base rate, all those pseudonyms, that's a really key thing, and covers some large percentage, maybe 80% of inpatient care, okay? So that, anyway, so that's a thing. Those numbers range again from, let's call it $8,000 up to about $20,000 and $25,000 or so. Okay. Now, the other things, that doesn't cover everything. Typically, there'll be things carved out of the DRG. Well, actually, let me cover this before. Next thing is that within the DRG, it's sort of like staying at a hospital. You don't get billed separately for the Tylenol, and if they bring you a razor and the soap and the whatever, everything's in that DRG. So you stay for 6 days, you get some drugs, you get some labs, you get some imaging, you get some physician care, you're in the operating room. Boom, that's how much it costs. Yeah? So that's the idea. However, there's certain types of care that in certain contracts are not in there. Often maternity and obstetrics are not in there, right? And so again, this would have a base rate of this. This means every time you deliver a baby, it's going to cost $10,000 in Northwell Hospital, right? But then it would say, okay, um, then, um, but then there'll be other details in here, such as if somebody has a C-section and stays longer than 5 days, they have to pay $4,000 for every additional day. So there's some details in here that get essentially carved out, and those can be, again, sometimes as what's called a per diem, which is you stay per day, or sometimes as a percentage of charges, meaning whatever the hospital charges. That makes sense? And do people know what a charge master is? Charges, basically just a list of all these hospital prices, and it tends to be very, very high, and we negotiate a percentage of that. So again, we have this base rate, and then you've got certain things excluded from the neutral base rate. Transplants, maternity, let's see what else this one has. Other weird extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, et cetera, some very esoteric stuff, okay? And they, and then, et cetera, the, burn unit, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So so you can see that's why about the majority of the care goes in this base rate, but there are a few things that are not. Next, there's something often called a stop loss. So what happens is the hospitals, let's say somebody gets, has a bypass and is a really crazy, very complex case with, all sorts of comorbidities, and they have to stay in the hospital for months at a time or something like that. If you're a hospital, you're thinking, man, this kind of sucks. I probably spent $1 million on this one case, and all I'm getting is the stinking DRG base rate, of maybe $50,000 or something like that. Okay, well that doesn't. So for them, that's very risky for them, and so what they will say is, I want a stop loss, meaning if my charges as a hospital are higher than a certain amount, I want to get paid as a percentage of charges, not in a base rate. You get what I mean by that? So if I charge you over $500,000, I want to get paid as a percentage of charges. Okay? And that can work one of two ways. I always forget this, so I may screw it up right now. But there is first dollar stop loss, which I believe this is right. I might confuse first and second. First dollar stop loss is if I go over $500,000, let's say, whatever my stop loss limit is, the whole claim gets priced as a percentage of charges. So if it was $499,000, Oscar would pay $50,000 of charges. Oscar would pay $50K, right? But if it's $500,000 of charges, it flips, and the whole bill could be 50% of charges or $250K, right? And you could see why we might not like that, because it gives the hospital a weird incentive to just get people over the line, because for $1,000 in charges, they get paid an extra $200,000 in claims, right? Second, and probably more reasonable way of doing it, is second dollar stop loss, which is that if you go from $499,000 to $500,000, that additional increment is just billed at the percentage of charges. So Oscar would pay the $50,000 for the first amount up to the stop loss, whatever they pay the DRG base rate up until the stop loss, and then any marginal on top of that would be a percentage of charges. Okay, and that tends to be also a pretty significant driver of inpatient care, maybe 15% or something like 20%, something like that, maybe even more. Okay? And it depends, of course, the level where you set that. If you set the stop loss at $5 million, you're never going to hit it. So the weight goes all into the DRG. If you set it very low, like $100,000, a lot of the things will go into stop loss, so you're paying a lot of things as a percentage of charges.
Is that professional and facility claims?
Just inpatient, really. Oh. Although maybe it's just facility. Typically, outpatient claims don't get that large because people aren't there for that long, but it may apply to outpatient as well. I guess that's contract by contract. Typically, it's an inpatient issue. Okay. So those are basically, so you got inpatient, you got DRG base rate, you've got different carve-outs, and then you've got stop loss. Great. Now, a few things to note is that sometimes people get tricky, and in footnotes include things like the DRG base rate does not cover drugs or radiology, right? And Northwell actually did this, right? Well, that's obviously a big deal because if I have to pay separately for the towels at the hotel, it's going to cost me a little more to stay at the hotel. It's kind of like going on those discount airfare, and now I have to pay to put the bag, and I got to pay for this, and I got to pay for that, right? So we also have to figure that out. 90% of the time, it's in all of those services are included in the DRG base rate, although some people throw in these tricky footnotes all the way down here at the bottom, which we must read carefully, and that says, case rate, blah, 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 case rates. Anyway, I don't know. Somewhere in here they threw in something like that, I think. Okay. Like things like, anyway, okay. So you have to read these footnotes pretty carefully because then they'll say, well, actually, this thing doesn't include that. And you're like, oh, well, that's a big deal. That could be like 10% of the whole value. All right, so that's how we do these things. Now, remember when I said you quote things as a percentage of Medicare, right? You have to be very careful. This is critical for anybody who's talking to a hospital system. You screw this up all the time. Medicare pays different hospitals different amounts for inpatient care in the same region. So, here in New York, Medicare pays Mount Sinai differently than it pays NYU, pays differently than New York Presbyterian. All very close localities together, they all get paid differently. And that's largely due to weird esoteric Medicare stuff due to their calculations of the cost of care, whether it's an academic medical center, the percentage of low-income people it serves, blah, 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 blah. So, if you go to Mount Sinai and you say, how about a deal on inpatient care at 150% of Medicare? And you go to NYU and you say, how about a deal at 150% of Medicare? And they both say, sure. You're going to get different costs from those two contracts. So if you keep walking around and saying, I got a deal in New York, I built the New York network at 150% of Medicare, that doesn't mean anything. And it gets really confusing, okay? So you have to be very careful on inpatient care, and thus when you quote the whole value of a contract, you have to know whose Medicare are you talking about, okay? And if you're not specific about that, then you get really confused, okay? And now I'll add even more complexity, which is when we price, we create this internal Oscar concept called average Medicare in the region. So we'll kind of average NYU's and Sinai's and Presbyterian's Medicare based on some weird utilization weighted basis, and we'll say that's what we mean by sort of Medicare. And when we price, we as a network team give the actuarial and pricing teams what percentage of Medicare we achieved in that contract. So, and they are receiving it in average percentage of Medicare terms, by which I mean some blended average of NYU, Sinai, and Presbyterian. That's the terms they think they're getting. Yet, if you go to any one hospital and get a deal for 150% of Medicare, unless you get very lucky and you somehow get some average, you are going to quote a necessarily wrong number to the contracting team, to the pricing team. People understand this. Okay? So, all of our tools, internally, etc., are often very well built on this average percent of Medicare. Yet the hospitals, if you quote to them, are average Medicare, and you say 150, that means something different for them. So if you're negotiating a contract with a hospital, know what you're talking about, and if you say 150, you darn well better mean 150 for them, not 150 on average for the region. Okay? Don't screw that up if you're negotiating a contract. Okay, make sense? Now, so that more or less covers inpatient care. Inpatient. Boom, boom, boom. Now, let's go to the outpatient side. So here, this is a little clearer. So first of all, we don't have this crazy Medicare different pricing thing on the outpatient side. outpatient is paid, everybody gets this in a region geographically, and you have to be careful about geographic region, but everybody in a geographical region gets paid the same amount, so that's nice. And here, basically, the big things are emergency room, and then observation, and then there's radiology, pathology, and that sort of thing are the big ones, as well as some ambulatory surgery procedures, which we Northwell has as a separate category, but we just all put into outpatient care. Okay, so you don't need to know a ton about all of these. The one thing to note that where's my emergency room sometimes has different levels. Here it just has one rate per visit, but it actually gets coded with different levels. Like sniffles is level 1, level 5 is like real serious, like, you know, trauma or whatever that's likely to go inpatient or something like that. And so a lot of our contracts will price as a we'll break those out. And there's a little bit of an issue of making sure that each hospital doesn't be like, oh, every case was really a level 5, right? That sort of thing. And also similarly, like, anyway, what is if somebody's just hanging in the hospital for observation, they're not really admitted inpatient. Sometimes people will, like, they'll count observation as admissions to inpatient. So there's some games that the hospitals will do and whatever, so we have to have some monitoring on that. But anyway, those are the basic elements. There's emergency room, observation, a few radiology, pathology, and then all of the ambulatory surgery procedures. Those are basic categories. Note that on outpatient, and I guess on all this stuff, but particularly on outpatient, things can really price in 3 ways. They can price as dollars, they can price as a percentage of charges, and they can price as a percentage of CMS, mostly, or some fee schedule. So usually CMS, but you might have an Oscar fee schedule, you might have whatever. And you should just know which one is going to which. So you can see here, radiology is 50% of charges. This one's in dollar terms. This one's mostly as a percentage of Medicare, right? And you have all these 3 different things. Okay. Now, note that for new markets and new participants, and this is true outpatient, inpatient, whatever, we need to, if they price things as a percentage of charges, we don't know what the heck that means. It's like walking into the grocery store and saying, it's hat, we'll give you a 50% discount. Well, what's the price? Like, what do you mean? And people don't typically, and so that's an issue for new markets. For old markets, we have their claims, and so we know, oh, that's how much you charge for this, how much you charge for that, whatever. But for new markets, we don't know what the heck they mean by these things. We do know what Medicare is. Okay, they publish that. That's cool. We do know dollars, because that's simple, but we don't know what charges is. And so contracts that price with large things as a percentage of charges require us to go to the hospital and say, hey, give us some, either I need you to not do that, or I need you to give me what your charge master is, or give me some claims, like price a bunch of claims for me, tell me what it is, and then boom, that'll be helpful, right? So that's an issue for us. Okay? So that's that. And then physician services, so are probably the simplest of all of them. So physician services are almost always just a percentage of the Medicare CPT code, and that's that. Yeah. There will be sometimes carve-outs in physician contracts where they'll say, well, yeah, but I'll take 150% of Medicare, but for these 10 CPT codes, I want to get paid a dollar terms. I want to get paid more than Medicare because I don't think Medicare covers my costs on these 10 items, something like that. Of course, you have to be very careful about that because, like, what do you think are the most likely high volume codes for that practice? Are those 10 codes, right? And so, if I am running a practice where I know I do a certain code a lot, I can carve that out, get paid double Medicare, and trick all these insurance companies who don't know and boom, then all of a sudden I'm getting paid more on a weighted average basis. So we have to be thoughtful about getting negatively selected about, if somebody says, well, that essentially it's like in the grocery store, we're going to make the steaks 5 times expensive, and then invite a bunch of meat lovers into the thing, into the store. Okay, well, we got to account for that. Yeah. So that's basically it. So you have inpatient, all those issues on the inpatient side, outpatient side, and physician. Okay, those are all the prices. Two things. We have to. The next thing is over. Those things need to vary across time. So each year will agree, but a contract usually has multiple years of term. So we have a thing called an escalator, right? And an escalator just says it could be usually between 0 and 8% or so, usually 3 to 5, and it just says how much are all of these prices going to go up year by year, right? It's a little insane that it's always above the inflation rate, but that's welcome to healthcare. So what that'll do is and usually it's one number for the entire contract, right? So it'll say everything that's $1, just multiply it by 1.05, and that's the next year, and then multiply it by 1.05 again. Okay, pretty simple. Issues you have to worry about with escalators. Are you going to increase the percentage of CMS and the percentage of charges, right? Because CMS will increase its prices or change its prices year to year, and the hospital can increase its charge master year by year. Okay, so what you don't want to have happen, and we negotiated our contracts, unfortunately missing this previously, which is, okay, 20% of charges, and two things are going to happen. The hospital is going to increase its charge master, usually by 8 or 10%, and our percentage of charges is going to go up by 5%. That means in aggregate, we're paying 14, 15% escalators. That will kill our business, right? So we can't do that. Or if at least we got to be pretty darn clear of what we're doing. So we can never do that, but it's generally a bad idea. And if we do it, the pricing team has really got to know that so we can change our prices. Yeah, makes sense? So typically we try to push. So dollars are easy. Anything that's a dollar thing, it just goes up by a percentage. Anything that's a percentage of CMS, typically what we'll do is either leave it at a flat percent CMS, or if somebody wants a fixed escalator, we'll say, fine, leave the year as it was, so call it 2017 CMS, and then put an escalator on that, so that you don't both get the increase in the CMS rates and the increase in the percent CMS. So there's a lot of things. So you can say, this one says, then current Medicare. You could also say 2017 Medicare. Yeah?
So,
yeah.
But for that though, you're basing it off of 2017 CMS, and at that point, 2017 CMS wasn't released. So, like, this is something we're seeing with the Arizona partner now, is we're committing to 2019 CMS, and we don't know what that is, and neither do they, and you won't until after the contract is due. So why is that to our advantage? To commit to a year when we don't know if those, is Medicare decreasing the price, which is good for us? Are they drastically increasing the CPT code? And why would we want to commit to that when it's such a huge variable?
Well, so first of all, I don't like a little bit fair enough, although I don't think it's probably that big a deal, is my sense of it. In that there's definitely risk that we would bear in understanding exactly how Medicare is going to price and what Medicare inflation would be. I think there's generally bounds of how much that goes up. It's not like Medicare goes up 7% and then -2 and whatever. It's kind of like this. And so it's not. There's always risks in how we price. That doesn't mean that it's not that big a deal. And then the nicer thing is that after next year, we will know exactly what it will be every year after that. Although I suppose it's nicer to say, X% of 2018 Medicare. And typically that's a bit how we do those things. But it's usually not that big a deal. And whenever we price something as a percentage of CMS, of then current CMS, we have the uncertainty of what will CMS's costs be relative to what we thought they would be. And that's always, like, every contract that has then current CMS has that issue. Okay? Okay, so that's how we handle. So again, escalators. We talked about how we handle percent CMS. On the charges side, what we want to do is we have something called charge master protection. And the basic notion there is, hey, hospital, you can't increase your charge master because they're just making these prices up, basically, right? Whatever they want. We want to say, hey, listen, if we're going to do anything as a percentage of charges in this contract, you can't like just jack the price up 50% on us over a year. That's not fair. So pretty much every contract that's greater than 1 year in term has to have charge master protection in it. Usually there's a couple different ways to do it. One way to do it is to say on an aggregate weighted average basis, Oscar will not experience charge master increases more than X. Yeah? Usually, and if that number is greater than 0, we have to be careful that the percentage of charges don't also increase at the same time. Yeah? So that if we say we're capping you, this contract caps Northwell at 8% aggregate charges, we have to be careful to say, okay, we're not also going to increase the percentage charges. Yeah. One way to do it, but if they say, well, fine, but a lot of the times hospitals will say, yeah, but I don't want to do it that way because I don't know what your utilization is. I just want to be able to increase my charge master as I want, and and I don't want Oscar's view on, well, this is my utilization, and we have all these nerdy analytical debates, and we fight it out because Oscar said it was 8.1, but we thought it was less, and whatever. So a lot of hospitals don't want to give us that ability. So instead, usually what we have to do is say, fine, let's do the following. Let's say we're going to cap your charge master increase at 0 on every line item. In other words, we're going to use the original charge master, the first year charge master. Right? And then, then we'll increase your percent of charges year by year. Similar to what we do in CMS, we say then current CMS, we're going to say almost like then current charge master. Sorry, not then current. 2017 CMS, 2017 charge master. And we're going to say freeze it, 0% increase. No increases at all. But what we will give you is an increase in the percentage of charges. So we'll go from 20 to 21% charges, which is a 5% increase. 5% increase. But the literal nominal dollar amounts of every item have to stay where they are. Okay? So that's what we typically do, one of those two things for charge master protection. And it is a really important thing as we're negotiating and managing these contracts to make sure that we have charge master protection in place. Okay? So now, zooming all the way out, we had the aggregate price of the groceries, right? Which is some way like 150% Medicare on average, right? Which breaks down into all these individual inpatient, outpatient, physician. Each one of those break into all these individual line items, which we just discussed exactly how they're priced. And then there's the quantity of how much we're going to use of each one. In other words, sort of the weights of each item. Yeah? So we didn't talk about that. So I want to talk about what that looks like. Questions before I move forward? Is this all making sense? Okay, I know it's a lot of stuff. Go back, watch the video. So now, so obviously, when you quote something as percent Medicare, like it matters. Are you going to buy? Are you going to buy a lot of deliveries? Are you going to have a lot of inpatient care? Are you going to have a lot of emergency room care? Because you can imagine, what if the emergency room rate is really high, but nobody goes to the emergency room in the city, or vice versa, or a lot of people go to the emergency room? That will obviously change how much the percentage of Medicare is, right? Because there's all these different, okay, sometimes we're above this, we're low, we're high, low, whatever. And so we need to have some sense of what's a lot and what's a little. The way that and that's how we need the combo of those two things to price a contract and get an aggregate percent CMS. We need to have a rate table, and then we need to know utilization or weights, okay? The way that we do that is by running claims through a contract. So basically, we take this Excel sheet, and I'll show you how we do this, but we literally encode it into a computer file, and then we take our claims, and we just price all of our claims through that. Just run all of our claims, and then we say, how much would all of that cost? And then, how much would Medicare have priced on all of those claims? Right? So basically that's what we do. In other words, it's sort of like unleashing a whole bunch of people to shop at the grocery store, and then unleashing Medicare to shop at the grocery store. And then on a per person basis, we can we can look at the total costs on those two things. That makes sense? Obviously, one source of issues is what if our claims are non-representative of the population in which we're going to serve? And often that's a big source of contention with hospital systems because they have their own, and whatever. And so often what will happen is we will say 150% of CMS. They'll say, cool, we agree. And we'll know that it's their CMS, not this other CMS, because we're smart. And then we will go, then we'll get into a rate table, and we'll say, boom, here's all these things, etc. Then we'll go price it, we'll run our claims, and they'll say, no, that contract's at 140% of Medicare. And we'll say, what are you talking about? It's 150% of Medicare, right? And then what we have to do is get under the hood and say, well, how many deliveries did you assume? How many ER visits did you assume? Like all of these sorts of things, right? And that can be a pain in the ass. That is a reason why, and we have the notions of trying to sort of fudge it to be, lower. They want to fudge it to be higher, whatever it is. That is the reason why when we are negotiating a contract, it is not good enough to just say 150% of Medicare, get a handshake, even a written email. You have to get a rate table agreed to. A rate table must be agreed to for a contract for us to know what we've actually agreed to. Because we can't just say, because there's too much variability in those conversations, and often when we say 150, we end up really getting like 155 and they probably end up getting like 145 in their terms, and both sides kind of just deal with it. But if we can't go to the pricing team and say, yeah, we got a handshake deal at 150. Sometimes we do because we ran out of time, but typically we then will bump it and say, actually, we got 155. So if we get a handshake deal with some health system at 150, probably means we're about to get 155, and that's probably what we should tell the pricing team. But we probably don't want to do anything until we actually get a rate table agreed. Make sense?
Pricing team like the actuarial team?
Yeah, actuarial team, and then Edith and the pricing folks. Okay, everything makes sense. All right. So literally, I want to show then literally how this works. So let's see. The first thing. So here we have a thing. So in terms of the workflow, when often we'll get this handshake deal on 150% of Medicare. That's about what, we'll negotiate and we'll say, okay, yeah, are we in the ballpark? Great. Okay, send me a rate table. And then usually we will try to send our rate table because we want to have as much as we can our standard slicing and dicing of rows so that it's easier for us to process, everything's more consistent or whatever. If they have some rate table that they like and some organization of the line items, we'll deal with that and that's fine. And so that's part of the negotiation is who's going to send the rate table. We typically, and it's somewhat industry standard, but not completely, for the insurance company to send the rate table. So we've built a tool that's called our Go Out Generator. And what it does is you just put in your target inpatient percentage, your target outpatient percentage, and which hospital you're talking to. And it'll say, this is Mount Sinai, and if I'm targeting these things, and then it'll output all of the rates that we are interested in. Yeah? Then what this does is this then will then go out with all the individual things that we, etc., that we want. The stop loss, you can see all these different carve-outs, percent charges, blah, 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 blah. And that would be, and so you can then quickly put in like 150 and 150, and I don't know if this will update or whatever. Maybe it won't update anyway. Yep, boom, that updates, okay? Yeah? And so, and then I'm not we can go. I won't go through the workflows now exactly, but more or less what we do is we take this, put in the numbers, check to make sure everything's good, add all the, and then format it, add footnotes, etc., and send it into an Excel document that we boom send to the hospitals. Okay, and so that's a pretty actually great innovation that we had. We didn't actually have that. It used to be like every contract was like, I don't know, let's figure it out. So okay, that's our go out generator. Then of course they never agree to that, and they'll go back and they'll like change a few numbers. Sometimes they'll change the structure. Hopefully they don't, but whatever. They'll say, well, I want to bump this number up and that number up and that number up and whatever. And you're like, okay. They don't just scale the whole thing by like a factor 1.1, which would be easy. They just like change a few numbers and whatever. So, okay, and then that gets to be a pain in the ass because we then have to price that whole thing and just figure out, well, what did it mean to change the maternity rate but not the overall DRG rate? Was that a big deal or not a big deal? In other words, what does that mean for my aggregate percent CMS? Yeah? So what Julian has largely so what I won't be able to show is basically Julian and the data team have devised a language which gets coded into a YAML file, which is a type of computer program file. And it literally has a language to take an Excel sheet that looks like this and put it into something a computer can understand. And so it'll say, so it'll have different amounts of codes. So it'll say, these codes are carved out of the DRG, these codes are in the DRG. Am I going to pay them at a case rate? Am I going to pay them at a per diem? Am I paying them at a percent of charges? So they created this language that you can take this, put it into code, and then a machine can read it, essentially. And then there's a repo that exists that just says every version of a contract that we send has its own version of code. And so then we can when we're negotiating, we can say, okay, there's version 1, 1.1, 1.1, then we make big changes, 2.1, whatever it is. And we can look at every single version that went back and forth, and we can know the value of every single version. Yeah? Does that all make sense? And so that's a lot of what the Sarah Alice and they're doing is they're taking these Excel sheets, they're turning them into code, and then they're running through a bunch of claims through them in order to get the value of all the changes that were made. Make sense? And so, let's see if I can. So then, again, this is weird. There we are. Okay. Now, so what I can do is here, I can instead, let's say I want to take I'm negotiating the banner contract, and I want that one. I would say HCA. That's weird. Anyway. Okay, this shouldn't. So what this will do is it'll say, okay, this is the Banner Phoenix contract, version 3.1, and I'm going to compare it to the first Banner contract that I sent. Okay? And what I can do then is you click Run, and what it will aggregately do is give me the overall percent of what I sent. So if my previous offer was at 150% of Medicare, this is 1.06 times that, or 159% of Medicare. Yeah? And it'll tell you, well, the inpatient rate went down, and the outpatient rate went up a good bit. So on a blended average rate, it's that. Yeah? And then what it will do is tell you the weights of each. So this 50% of all the volumes going through the DRG, 2.3% is going through maternity in this way, 2.1 is going through maternity C-sections, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it's 11, so people have to go. And so it'll give you all these different weights. So it'll know that, okay, if you change the cell, this is the weight of that cell. And then it'll give you the impact of each one of those. So then it'll say, okay, well, what happened here is they increased the drugs, they increased the implants, and they increased some other percent charges, outpatient drugs. Whereas they decreased the DRG rate and blah, 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 blah. Right? And so that and then boom, that's what it means on average. You can go line by line if you care, etc. So this is a pretty amazing tool that we then have to very quickly price these things and again, give us a number that is pretty useful. And this is really what the relationship managers, account managers, contracting people should all be really using, is this aggregate number. Okay? That's it.
Got some questions?
Yeah.
Great. So sounds like it's a big analytical exercise. I'm just wondering, just in practice, how much of it is like a, let's get together and compare spreadsheets, and then what percentage of that like relationship with that negotiation, like modeling mono component come in, if at all, like to get the deal done?
Well, mostly, the vast majority, I'd say, in most cases, the analytics are off by like 5% between us and the hospital system. So that the vast majority of the negotiation comes from negotiating the aggregate percentage of Medicare, and we might call that mono or whatever. So that's that. I mean, that's basically that. You have to. The analytics take time, and often like the hospital systems don't have all this stuff, so they take like weeks to process, and they all do it in crazy ways using Excel and like who the heck knows. And so you'll send them and be like, here's our rate table, and they'll be like, okay, I need to dial up the mainframe and get through blah blah blah, and I'll see you in a month or something. But usually we get like, except in a few cases, we get pretty close, within 5% or so. And then mostly it's just like going back and forth.
When we price the value of the contract using claims, do we just use historical claims, or do we make assumptions about how utilization might change, like certain services are now being offered in outpatient settings, so all these inpatient cases move to outpatient and things like that?
Mostly we will just right now we just use our aggregate claims experience, and we haven't thought about regional differences and whatever population differences. Obviously, if we go to Medicare or something like that, obviously very different populations, but we've heretofore had a relatively far less deliveries in Medicare and that sort of thing. Anyway, we just use our aggregate population, which is usually pretty close. Again, because all you really need to care about is the mix here. Is this bar chart is a little more inpatient, a little outpatient. What are the weights?
Right. No, I'm seeing more like knee replacements now are being done outpatient. So do they negotiate really high outpatient rates for those services because they're all kind of being moved from an inpatient setting, and how does that's like a new service delivery, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's we haven't really dealt with that. Those things tend to be a little more glacial in terms of how so that year by year you can kind of watch. Okay, more knee replacements are going outpatient. And that sort of thing, and we do have to be thoughtful. There's some times where claims from 4 years ago aren't all that useful for what's going to happen next year, so we have to be a little bit thoughtful of not running the entire thing. But it's healthcare, so things don't move that fast. It's not like overnight everything changes. So it hasn't been a big focus. There's obviously a lot of issues under the hood that can be improved here, and so that is one of them.
I guess along a similar type question. So for like the inpatient specifically, like when like a new innovation or like a new drug gets entered or like modules in the inpatient space, and let's say like it's a DRG, like oftentimes from the previous I've heard that like the DRGs often don't flex quick enough to allow hospitals to actually afford to accommodate that innovation. I guess just how do those usually get through the system? And does Medicare have to at some point make a decision like, oh, this is something we want to include DRG, so buff up the DRG, and then that sort of trickles down to all the other insurance companies?
Yeah, I mean, there's weird stuff like that. Well, so first of all, we can do whatever we want, and hospitals will say, listen, I know Medicare doesn't pay that, but we want to get paid differently. And that's a lot of what those carve-outs are. Is like, they don't pay for electro-knife therapy, blah, 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 but we want laser knife, whatever these things are, but we want to get paid for that. And so that's what those carve-outs are, in essence, to a certain degree, is literally doing that. And then, and then Medicare will make changes about what they're willing to reimburse, inpatient versus outpatient versus this, that, and the other. And so, and that will impact us as well. And because we do apply a lot in our payment policies, Like if somebody tries to do something inpatient that can obviously be done outpatient, we're not going to pay them a certain amount, you know what I mean? And so there's certain payment policies that we will have in place that are, again, our own, but the industry standard is definitely influenced by Medicare. So if Medicare changes stuff, typically people will sort of adopt it and whatever. But again, it's just a bilateral negotiation, and we get to do whatever we want with them. Okay, does this seem reasonably clear?